Hello everyone, I hope you're having a great day. Today, we're going to uncover the story of a white millionaire who tried to use money to publicly shame a black woman, only to discover that she knew the truth behind his fortune and turned the tables instantly. If you enjoy powerful stories about justice, accountability, and real change, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next video. Chicago, Illinois, downtown. Early evening. The ballroom of the Langford Grand Hotel glowed with warm gold light, marble floors reflecting crystal chandeliers that cost more than most homes in the city. This was the annual Westbridge Charity Investment Gala, a place where wealthy donors talked about generosity while quietly displaying power. At the center of the room stood Ethan Whitmore, a white millionaire, 56 years old, a real estate tycoon with a personal fortune exceeding $120 million. His suit was perfectly tailored, his smile practiced, his presence commanding. When Ethan spoke, people listened. When he moved, conversations shifted around him. This was his world, until his attention caught on someone who clearly did not belong. Near the far wall, beside a table of silent auction items, stood a young black woman. She was in her mid-20s, her skin a deep brown, her posture straight but reserved. She wore a simple red dress, unbranded, and no jewelry except for a thin silver necklace. On her feet were practical shoes, clean but worn. She wasn't holding a drink. She was holding a clipboard. Her name was Naomi Carter, a black girl raised on the south side of Chicago, now a black woman who had learned how to stand quietly in rooms that were not built for her. Ethan noticed her because she wasn't impressed. She wasn't staring at the chandeliers or scanning the room with nervous eyes. She wasn't trying to be seen. She was watching. "That one," Ethan said quietly to his business partner, Mark Reynolds, nodding toward her. "Who is she?" Mark followed his gaze. "Probably staff or a volunteer. They invite community groups to these things." Ethan smiled. "Interesting choice." Mark chuckled. "You're always looking for trouble." Ethan took a slow sip of his drink. Something about the black girl's calm unsettled him. People like her were usually grateful just to be allowed into rooms like this. They smiled too much, apologized too often. Naomi did neither. "I'm bored," Ethan said, adjusting his jacket. "Let's see what she's doing here." They walked toward her. Naomi noticed them approach and lifted her eyes, steady and alert. "You work for the hotel?" Ethan asked. Naomi met his gaze. Calm, direct. "No," she said. "I'm here representing the Carter Community Housing Initiative." Her voice was composed, educated. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Community housing?" "Yes." "And what do you do there?" he asked. "I'm the founder and director," Naomi replied. Ethan laughed. "You?" he said, openly amused. "You run it?" "Yes," she answered simply. The laughter around them softened. A few nearby guests slowed their conversations. Ethan looked her up and down, taking his time. "You don't look like someone who runs an organization," he said. "No offense." Naomi didn't react. Ethan reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a thick envelope. Cash. Crisp bills, deliberately visible. He held it loosely between his fingers. "I'll make this simple," he said. "I'll donate $50,000 to your project tonight." A murmur rippled through the room. Naomi said nothing. "But there's a condition," Ethan continued. "I want you to admit something. Right here." Mark shifted uncomfortably. Ethan waved him off. "Ethan, I want you to say," Ethan said, his voice loud enough for others to hear, "that without wealthy white donors like me, organizations run by black girls like you would fail." The air tightened. "Say you need us," Ethan went on. "Say your work depends on people like me. Say it, and the money is yours." All eyes turned to Naomi Carter. Some expected anger, some expected humiliation, some expected gratitude. Ethan expected submission. Naomi looked at the envelope. Then she looked back at Ethan. She smiled, slowly. "Before I answer," she said evenly, "may I ask you one question, Mr. Whitmore?" Ethan hesitated. "Go ahead." Naomi reached into her bag and removed a thin black tablet. She tapped the screen once and turned it toward him. "Do you recognize this building?" Ethan's smile faltered. The image showed an old apartment complex on the south side of Chicago. Cracked concrete, faded brick. His first major acquisition. Naomi's voice remained calm, but something in it sharpened. "Because this building," she said, "is where your empire actually began." Ethan said nothing. "And tonight," Naomi continued, "I didn't come here as a black girl asking for your money." She paused. "I came as a black woman who knows exactly how you made it." The ballroom fell silent. And before the truth is revealed, pause here for a moment. If you're listening and you believe dignity should never be bought with humiliation, subscribe to this channel, like this story, and leave a comment. Ask yourself this question: does money give anyone the right to shame another human being? Because in the next scene, Naomi Carter doesn't ask for permission. She exposes the truth. Ethan Whitmore never wanted spoken out loud. The ballroom remained frozen. No music, no laughter. Only the low hum of the chandelier lights above and the soft clink of a glass someone's hand was shaking too hard to steady. Ethan Whitmore stared at the image on the tablet. The building. He knew it instantly. 742 West Calumet Avenue, Southside Chicago. The first property he had ever bought. The one no one talked about anymore. Naomi Carter didn't rush him. She held the tablet steady, allowing the weight of recognition to sink in. "That building," she continued calmly, "was purchased in 2009 by one of your shell companies, Whitmore Holdings Group, LLC. But before your renovations, before the glossy brochures and rent hikes," she tapped the screen again. The image changed. Black mold crawling up the walls, broken stair rails, children's toys scattered in dark hallways. "That building was home to 72 black families," Naomi said. "Most of them single mothers, most of them living below the poverty line." A murmur spread through the crowd. Ethan felt heat rise up his neck. "That was over a decade ago," he said sharply. "I brought investment. I improved the property." Naomi nodded slowly. "You did improve the building," she agreed. "You just removed the people first." The room went quiet again. Mark Reynolds shifted beside Ethan. "Naomi, this really isn't the place." "It is exactly the place," Naomi replied without raising her voice. "Because this is where power speaks, and tonight, power needs to listen." She turned slightly, addressing not just Ethan, but the room. "My name is Naomi Carter," she said. "I am a black woman born 3 blocks from that building. My grandmother lived there. Apartment 3B. Several heads turned. "I grew up watching families disappear from that building, one eviction notice at a time. Rent doubled overnight. Repairs were delayed until people gave up and left. Those who complained were labeled problem tenants." She looked back at Ethan. "You call it revitalization," Naomi said. "We call it displacement." Ethan clenched his jaw. "You're twisting facts," he said. "Those were legal transactions." "They were profitable transactions," Naomi corrected. "There's a difference." She swiped again. Financial records appeared on the screen. "Your company purchased the property for $1.2 million, Naomi said. "Within 18 months, you refinanced it, tripled the valuation, and sold it for $4.9 million. A soft gasp rippled through the room. "That profit," Naomi continued, "came directly from families who had nowhere else to go." Ethan laughed once, sharp and defensive. "You think you're the first activist to accuse me of this?" he said. "This is business." Naomi's eyes didn't leave his. "And you think you're the first white millionaire to hide exploitation behind the word business?" The words landed hard. Someone in the back whispered, "Oh, damn." Naomi lowered the tablet. "You offered me money to humiliate myself," she said evenly, "to admit that black communities survive only because of your generosity." She shook her head slightly. "My organization exists," Naomi said, "because of people like you." Ethan scoffed. Finally, some honesty. "Not in the way you think," Naomi replied. She stepped closer. "The Carter Community Housing Initiative exists because your developments created the crisis we clean up after." The room erupted into low conversation. Naomi raised her voice slightly, just enough. "My work is rehousing families pushed out of neighborhoods you profit from, helping children who sleep in cars because their parents couldn't keep up with market adjustments." She met Ethan's eyes. "You don't donate to us because you're generous," she said. "You donate to ease your conscience." Ethan's smile was gone now. "You're standing at my event," he said coldly, "using my platform to attack me." Naomi nodded. "Yes." "And you think this ends well for you?" Ethan asked. Naomi's expression softened, not with fear, but with certainty. "It already has," she said. She turned back to the crowd. "I didn't come tonight to beg for money," Naomi said. "I came because several donors asked to hear directly from the communities impacted by large-scale redevelopment." She gestured toward the room. "Many of you invest in Ethan Whitmore's projects," she said. "You trust his numbers, his reputation." She lifted the tablet again. "But these are the numbers that don't make the brochures." The screen displayed testimonies, names, faces, a woman holding a child, an elderly man sitting in a car, a teenager standing outside a shelter. "These are the people displaced from Whitmore properties over the last 10 years, Naomi said. "And this," she tapped again, "is the cost my organization bears to keep them alive." Silence. Deep. Heavy. Ethan felt something unfamiliar creeping in. Loss of control. "This is inappropriate," he said. "Security." Before he could finish, a voice cut through the room. "Let her speak." All heads turned. The voice belonged to Margaret Lewis, chairwoman of the Westbridge Foundation and one of Ethan's largest investors. She stood slowly, eyes fixed on Naomi. "I'd like to hear more," Margaret said. Ethan stared at her. "Margaret." "Ethan," she said calmly, "you invited us here to talk about impact." She turned to Naomi. "Continue." Naomi nodded respectfully. "Thank you," she said. She turned back to Ethan one last time. "You asked me to say I need your money," Naomi said. "The truth is, Mr. Whitmore," she paused, "my community doesn't need your charity." The room held its breath. "We need accountability." Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came out. And before what happens next changes everything, pause here. If you're listening and you believe voices like Naomi's deserve to be heard, subscribe to this channel, like this story, and share your thoughts in the comments. Whose responsibility is it to fix the damage caused by profit-driven decisions? Because in the next scene, Ethan Whitmore will be forced to make a choice that could destroy or redefine his legacy. For the first time that evening, Ethan Whitmore felt the room move away from him, not physically, emotionally. The silence after Naomi's words wasn't empty. It was heavy, charged, the kind of silence that forms right before something breaks. Accountability. The word echoed in Ethan's head. He had built an empire on confidence, on certainty, on being the man with answers. But now, standing under the chandeliers of the Langford Grand Hotel, he felt exposed in a way he hadn't anticipated. Margaret Lewis remained standing. "Ethan," she said calmly, "you invited us here to talk about impact. Ms. Carter is doing exactly that." Ethan swallowed. "This is turning into a spectacle," he said. "This event has a purpose." "Yes," Margaret replied, "and perhaps tonight that purpose has finally arrived." A few guests nodded. Others looked down, uncomfortable. Some reached for their phones, discreetly recording. Ethan turned back to Naomi. "You've made your point," he said, "but don't pretend you're innocent in this. You benefit from the same system." Naomi didn't interrupt him. "You run a non-profit," Ethan continued. "You apply for grants. You seek donations from people like me. You operate within the structure you're criticizing." Naomi nodded slowly. "You're right," she said. "I do." She stepped forward again, closing the distance. "But the difference," Naomi said, "is that I see the cost." She gestured toward the tablet. "I see it in eviction notices taped to doors," she continued, "in kids who stop doing homework because they don't know where they'll sleep, in mothers choosing between rent and medicine." She looked Ethan directly in the eyes. "You see spreadsheets." A sharp breath escaped someone in the crowd. Ethan's jaw tightened. "You're simplifying a complex reality," he said. "Urban redevelopment isn't personal." Naomi's voice softened, but only slightly. "It's always personal to the people being pushed out." She turned back to the room. "My grandmother worked 3 jobs," Naomi said. "She cleaned offices downtown, offices owned by men like Mr. Whitmore. She paid her rent on time every month." Naomi's voice remained steady, but her eyes carried memory. When the notice came, she had 30 days to leave. No relocation assistance, no explanation she could understand, just a letter filled with legal language. She paused. "She died 2 years later," Naomi said quietly. "Not from illness, from stress, from exhaustion, from being told her life no longer fit the neighborhood she helped build." The room felt smaller now. Ethan shifted his weight. "That's tragic," he said, his voice stiff. "But you can't place that on me." Naomi nodded once. "I'm not asking you to carry guilt," she said. "I'm asking you to carry responsibility." Ethan laughed sharply. "Responsibility for what? Market forces?" "For choices," Naomi replied. She tapped the tablet again. A new slide appeared. A timeline. "Over the last 10 years," Naomi said, "your company acquired 14 properties in predominantly black neighborhoods. Within 2 years of each acquisition, average rents increased between 40 and 70%. Murmurs spread. "During that same period," Naomi continued, "my organization rehoused over 300 displaced families. Nearly half of them came from Whitmore-owned properties." Ethan stared at the screen. "That correlation doesn't prove causation," he said. "No," Naomi agreed, "but patterns do." She lowered the tablet. "You asked me to say I need your money," Naomi said. "The truth is, Mr. Whitmore, my work exists because people like you refuse to acknowledge the consequences of your success." The words cut deep. Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but another voice spoke first. "You're saying we're complicit." It was a man near the front, mid-50s, expensive suit. Naomi turned to him. "I'm saying we all have a choice," she replied, "to profit without looking back, or to build without destroying." The man nodded slowly. Ethan felt something else slipping now. Authority. The room was no longer his. He took a step forward, lowering his voice. "You're very confident," he said, "for someone standing in a room full of people who could shut your funding down with a phone call." Naomi didn't back away. "You could," she said, "and I'd still be right." A beat. "And I'd still show up tomorrow," Naomi continued, "because my community doesn't disappear when funding dries up. They're still there, still hurting, still waiting to be seen. The room was completely silent. Ethan exhaled slowly. "What do you want?" he asked. The question slipped out before he could stop it. Naomi studied him for a moment. "I want you to stop pretending your success exists in a vacuum," she said. "I want transparency, fair relocation practices, investment that includes the people who already live there." She paused. "And I want you to stop offering money as a way to silence truth." Ethan laughed quietly, not amused, not dismissive, uncertain. "You think a speech changes anything?" he asked. Naomi met his gaze. "No," she said. "Actions do." She stepped back, returning to her original position. "I didn't come here to fight you," Naomi said. "I came here to make sure you couldn't pretend you didn't know." The crowd stirred. Margaret Lewis spoke again. "Ethan," she said, "I think it's time we discuss this publicly, as investors." Several heads nodded. Ethan felt the walls closing in. He looked around the room. Faces he'd known for years now studied him differently, evaluating, judging. For the first time in his career, Ethan Whitmore was not the one setting the narrative. Naomi Carter was. And this was only the beginning. Pause here. If you're listening and you believe truth should never be silenced by money, subscribe to this channel, like this story, and share your thoughts in the comments. Should success come with responsibility, or only profit? Because in the next scene, Ethan Whitmore will be forced to confront the one place he's avoided for years, his past. And it will cost him far more than money. The room slowly returned to motion. Glasses were lifted again. Conversations resumed in hushed tones. But something fundamental had shifted. The Langford Grand Hotel ballroom no longer felt like a place of celebration. It felt like a courtroom. Ethan Whitmore stood near the edge of the room, his back straight, his face composed. On the surface, nothing had changed. But inside, something had cracked. He excused himself quietly and stepped out onto the balcony overlooking Michigan Avenue. The city glowed below him. Endless traffic, endless ambition, endless proof that he had won. And yet, for the first time in years, Ethan felt the weight of how he got here. Footsteps approached behind him. Mark Reynolds joined him, loosening his tie. That was unexpected. Ethan didn't respond. "She blindsided you," Mark continued. "But it'll pass. It always does." Ethan rested his hands on the cold railing. "No," he said quietly. "This is different." Mark frowned. "Different how?" Ethan exhaled slowly. "She wasn't guessing." Mark hesitated. "What do you mean?" Ethan didn't answer. Because the truth was, Naomi Carter had touched something he'd spent years burying. 742 West Calumet Avenue. Ethan remembered the day he bought that building. He had been 29 years old, newly divorced, deep in debt. His first development had failed, leaving him desperate for a win. Banks were hesitant, investors skeptical. That building wasn't an opportunity, it was a gamble. He remembered walking through the hallways for the first time. The smell of damp concrete, flickering lights, children peeking from behind doors. He told himself he was doing them a favor. He told himself it was necessary. At the time, he didn't see families. He saw risk. "You can't build an empire worrying about everyone you step over," his mentor had told him. Ethan believed that, and it worked, for years. Until tonight. Behind him, the balcony door opened again. Naomi Carter stepped out. Ethan stiffened. "I'm not finished," he said without turning around. "I'm not here to continue," Naomi replied calmly. "I'm here to understand." Ethan laughed quietly. "Understand what? That I'm the villain in your story?" Naomi stepped beside him, keeping a respectful distance. "No," she said. "I don't believe people are villains. I believe they make choices. Ethan turned to face her. You think you know me because you pulled up some old records? He asked. I think I know what you avoided, Naomi replied. Silence stretched between them. Why that building? Naomi asked. Ethan hesitated. It was cheap, he said finally. No one wanted it. And the people? Naomi asked. Ethan looked away. They were expendable. The word hung heavy. Naomi didn't react. She simply nodded. That's what I thought, she said. Ethan felt irritation rise. You don't know what it's like to start with nothing. Naomi looked at him then, really looked at him. You're wrong, she said. I know exactly what it's like. She leaned against the railing. My grandmother worked cleaning offices in this city, Naomi said. She used to come home with swollen hands and a smile because she'd made enough to keep the lights on. Ethan said nothing. She believed if you worked hard and followed the rules, you'd be safe, Naomi continued. That belief killed her. Ethan clenched his fists. I didn't kill anyone, he said. No, Naomi replied. But you benefited from a system that did. Ethan turned away again, staring at the traffic below. For a long time, he said quietly, I thought success meant never looking back. Naomi listened. I told myself people like you would always need someone like me, Ethan continued, that without people like me, nothing would move. He laughed softly. It made it easier. To what? Naomi asked. To sleep, Ethan replied. Naomi nodded slowly. Then tonight was always going to happen, she said. Ethan turned toward her. You didn't come here just to embarrass me, he said. This was planned. Yes, Naomi admitted, but not the way you think. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folded document. I didn't come alone, she said. Ethan frowned. She handed him the paper. He unfolded it. A proposal. A redevelopment partnership. Community-led. Shared ownership. Long-term affordability guarantees. Ethan scanned the page quickly. This is impossible, he said. My board would never agree. Naomi met his eyes. Then your board is the problem, she said. Ethan scoffed. You think one night changes everything? Naomi's voice softened. No, she said, but it forces a decision. She stepped back toward the door. I don't need your money, Naomi said, but you need to decide what kind of man you want to be remembered as. She paused. Because people are already watching. Naomi walked back inside. Ethan remained on the balcony, holding the proposal. For the first time in his life, Ethan Whitmore didn't feel powerful. He felt exposed. And for the first time, he wondered whether his success was built on something rotten. Pause here for a moment. If you're listening and you believe confronting the past is the first step toward real change, subscribe to this channel, like this story, and leave a comment. Can someone rebuild their legacy after years of harmful choices? Because in the next scene, Ethan will be forced to face the one place he's avoided since the beginning, the neighborhood where it all started. And that visit will change him forever. Southside Chicago. The next morning. The black sedan slowed as it turned onto West Calumet Avenue. Ethan Whitmore sat in the back seat, eyes fixed on the street outside. The buildings here were older, lower, quieter. No glass towers, no valet stands, just brick, concrete, and people moving through their day with practiced caution. Pull over, Ethan said. The driver hesitated. Sir? Here, Ethan repeated. The car stopped beside the curb. Ethan stepped out. The door closed behind him with a soft thud, sealing him into a world he hadn't walked through in over a decade. This was the neighborhood where it began. 742 West Calumet Avenue stood at the end of the block, renovated now. Fresh paint, new windows, A security camera mounted above the entrance. The sign read, Calumet Heights Residences in sleek lettering. Ethan stared at it. He remembered when the sign was crooked, the paint peeling, the hallway lights flickering. He remembered walking those halls with a clipboard, calculating costs, ignoring faces. Don't get attached, his mentor had said. Numbers don't cry. Ethan walked toward the entrance. A woman sweeping the sidewalk paused and watched him approach. She was older, maybe late 60s, wrapped in a coat despite the mild weather. You lost? She asked. Ethan stopped. No, he said. I used to own this building. The woman studied him. Used to, she repeated. Yes. She nodded slowly. Then you're one of the reasons my sister lives in Indiana now. Ethan felt the words land. I'm sorry, he said automatically. She laughed once, not amused. Sorry doesn't bring people back, she said. You here to buy something else? No, Ethan replied. I'm here to see. She considered him, then returned to sweeping. You're late, she said. But seeing is better than pretending. Ethan walked inside. The lobby smelled of fresh paint and disinfectant. Clean, orderly, empty. A property manager looked up from the desk. Can I help you? I'm Ethan Whitmore, he said. I developed this building. The man stiffened. I'll call corporate. No need, Ethan replied. I'm just visiting. He took the stairs. Each step echoed. Second floor, third floor. He stopped outside apartment 3B. Naomi's words returned to him. My grandmother lived there. Ethan raised his hand, hesitated, then knocked. The door opened slowly. A young woman stood there, holding a toddler on her hip. Behind her, the apartment was small but clean. Sparse furniture, careful order. Yes? She asked. I'm sorry to bother you, Ethan said. I used to own this building. I was wondering, how long have you lived here? The woman narrowed her eyes slightly. 3 months, she said. Why? Before you moved in, Ethan asked, did you live nearby? She laughed bitterly. Nearby? No, I was in my car. 2 weeks. The child shifted in her arms. They raised the rent where we were, she continued. My paycheck didn't. I applied here through a housing lottery. Ethan swallowed. I'm glad you found a place, he said. She studied him carefully. You're not looking for praise. No, Ethan replied. I'm looking for truth. She nodded slowly. Then here's some, she said. This place is better, but it cost someone else everything. She closed the door gently. Ethan stood there for a long moment. Then he continued up the stairs. At the top floor, he stepped out onto the roof. The city stretched out before him. Familiar, but different. He had built his empire looking forward, never back. Now the past stood right in front of him. Footsteps behind him. Naomi Carter joined him, her coat pulled tight against the wind. I figured you'd come, she said. You followed me, Ethan replied. No, Naomi said. I live 3 blocks away. That surprised him. You stayed, he said. Yes, she replied. Someone had to. They stood side by side, looking out over the neighborhood. I saw apartment 3B, Ethan said quietly. Naomi nodded. She never complained, Naomi said. Even when the heat went out, even when the notice came. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. I told myself it was just business, he said, that if I didn't do it, someone else would. Naomi looked at him. And did that make it easier? She asked. Yes, Ethan admitted. For a long time. They stood in silence. I don't want your money, Naomi said again. I want you to understand scale. She turned toward him. You move millions with a signature, she said. I move families with a phone call. We're both working systems. Yours just breaks people faster. Ethan exhaled. What would accountability look like? He asked. Naomi didn't answer immediately. Start by listening, she said. Then by changing how you build. She reached into her bag and handed him another document. A list. Addresses, names, dates. These are families displaced from your properties, Naomi said. Some found housing, some didn't. Ethan stared at the list. And this? He asked. That's the cost, Naomi replied. Not financial. Human. Ethan folded the paper carefully. I don't know if I can fix all of this, he said. Naomi met his eyes. No one asked you to, she said, but you can stop making it worse. A siren wailed in the distance. Ethan looked around the rooftop. For years, he said, I thought impact was measured in returns. Naomi shook her head. Impact is measured in who gets to stay, she said. Ethan nodded slowly. I need to call my board, he said. Naomi raised an eyebrow. Not for approval, Ethan continued. For honesty. She studied him. That would be new, she said. Ethan managed a small, uncertain smile. Before they parted, Naomi spoke again. This isn't about redemption, she said. It's about responsibility. Ethan nodded. And if I choose wrong? He asked. Naomi's voice was steady. Then we keep fighting, she said, with or without you. She turned and walked down the stairs. Ethan remained on the rooftop, holding the list. For the first time, the city below didn't look like a trophy. It looked like a ledger. Pause here. If you're listening and you believe real change begins when powerful people are willing to look at the consequences of their success, subscribe to this channel, like this story, and leave a comment. Can accountability coexist with ambition? Because in the next scene, Ethan Whitmore will face the most dangerous moment of all, not public criticism, but private choice. And whatever he decides will change more than his reputation. Downtown Chicago. Whitmore Holdings headquarters. 2 days later. The boardroom sat on the 37th floor, wrapped in glass and steel. From here, the city looked clean, organized, predictable. Exactly the way Ethan Whitmore had always liked it. The long table was already filled. 7 board members, 3 senior investors, 2 attorneys. Every seat occupied by someone who had helped Ethan build his empire, or expected him to protect it. Ethan stood at the head of the table, hands resting lightly on the polished wood. He looked calm. He was not. Let's begin, said Charles Avery, the board chairman, a man in his late 60s, whose voice carried the authority of decades of capital. Ethan nodded and activated the screen behind him. I asked for this emergency meeting because we have a problem, Ethan said, and pretending it doesn't exist will cost us more than facing it. A few eyebrows lifted. Charles leaned back. We've reviewed the incident at the gala, he said. Our legal team sees no liability. That's not what this meeting is about, Ethan replied. He clicked the remote. A map appeared, dots scattered across the south side. These are our residential properties acquired between 2009 and 2018, Ethan said. 14 buildings. He clicked again. Another layer appeared. Eviction rates, rent increases, displacement figures. The room grew quieter. What is this? Asked Linda Park, a major investor. It's the part of our business we don't put in presentations, Ethan said, but it's real. Charles folded his hands. Ethan, are you suggesting we revisit old deals? I'm suggesting we acknowledge their impact, Ethan said, and change how we operate moving forward. A murmur spread. This sounds like guilt talking, said Robert Klein, one of the attorneys. We complied with the law. Yes, Ethan said, and we failed people anyway. Silence. Charles frowned. You're letting a non-profit activist dictate strategy? Ethan met his eyes. I'm letting the truth dictate strategy. He clicked again. A new slide appeared. A proposal. Community stabilized development model. Affordable housing guarantees. Relocation funds written into contracts. Shared ownership with community trusts. Caps on rent increases. Linda leaned forward. This would reduce profit margins significantly. Yes, Ethan said. In the short term. Robert shook his head. Our shareholders won't accept this. Ethan inhaled slowly. Then we explain why they should, he said. Charles's voice hardened. You're talking about dismantling the very structure that made this company successful. Ethan paused. For years, he said, I told myself success meant never looking back, that the market decided winners and losers. He looked around the table. I was wrong. A sharp intake of breath from someone. Charles stared at him. Careful, Ethan continued. We built wealth by moving faster than the consequences, he said, by treating neighborhoods as numbers. That ends now, Robert scoffed. And if we don't agree? Ethan's voice was steady. Then I stepped down as CEO. The room exploded. What? You're serious? This is reckless. Charles stood. Ethan, you're emotional. This isn't how leadership works. Ethan met his gaze. This is exactly how leadership works, he said, when the cost becomes visible. Silence returned, heavier than before. Linda broke it. If you step down, you lose control. Ethan nodded. I know. And the board will reverse everything you're proposing, Robert added. Maybe, Ethan said. Or maybe you won't. Charles narrowed his eyes. You're betting the company on a moral argument. Ethan nodded again. Yes. He looked at each person in the room. For the first time, I'm asking us to build something that doesn't require pretending people don't exist. No one spoke. Minutes passed. Finally, Linda sighed. What's driving this? Ethan answered honestly. I went back to the neighborhoods we built over, he said. I met the people who live with the consequences of our success. He paused. And I realized something. Charles crossed his arms. Which is? Legacy isn't what you leave behind, Ethan said. It's what you leave intact. The room fell silent again. Charles sat slowly. This will fracture our investor base, he said. Yes, Ethan replied, but it will also define us. Robert leaned forward. You're asking us to choose uncertainty over guaranteed returns. Ethan shook his head. I'm asking you to choose responsibility over denial. Another pause. Linda looked at the proposal again. If we do this, she said, we do it publicly. Ethan nodded. Transparency is the point. Charles closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. Call for a vote, he said. One by one, hands lifted. Not all, but enough. Charles exhaled. The motion passes, he said quietly. On a trial basis. Ethan felt his shoulders drop. This isn't redemption, Charles added. This is risk. Ethan nodded. I know. As the meeting adjourned, Ethan remained seated, staring at the city through the glass. For the first time, the skyline didn't look like conquest. It looked like responsibility. Later that afternoon, Ethan walked alone into his office. On his desk lay Naomi Carter's proposal. He picked up his phone. Naomi, he said when she answered. The board agreed. There was a pause on the line. On what terms? Naomi asked. On yours, Ethan said. Silence again. Then, quietly. Then this is where the real work begins. Ethan nodded, even though she couldn't see him. Yes, he said. It is. Pause here. If you're listening, and you believe leadership is proven not when power is easy, but when it's challenged, subscribe to this channel, like this story, and share your thoughts in the comments. Would you risk everything to do what's right? Because in the next scene, Ethan and Naomi will stand side by side for the first time, not as opponents, but as uneasy partners. And the city will be watching. Chicago woke up to the news at 6:12 a.m. Whitmore Holdings announces community stabilized development model. CEO admits past harm, commits to structural reform. By 7 o'clock a.m., it was everywhere. Televisions in diners, radios in cars, phones buzzing on nightstands across the city. Ethan Whitmore stood in his kitchen, coffee untouched, watching his own face on the morning news. A stunning reversal from one of Chicago's most powerful real estate developers, the anchor said. The move follows a public confrontation at last week's charity gala with housing advocate Naomi Carter. The screen shifted. Naomi, her photo, calm, unsmiling. Ethan turned the TV off. His phone vibrated immediately. Investor calls, media requests, text messages that ranged from cautious support to outright fury. You've lost your mind. This will tank the stock. About time someone did this. You just admitted liability. Ethan exhaled and picked up his phone. Naomi, he said when she answered. It's happening. I know, Naomi replied. I've already had 3 interview requests. Are you going to do them? Ethan asked. Yes, she said. But not alone. There was a pause. You want me there, Ethan said. I want you accountable, Naomi replied. There's a difference. Ethan nodded. Name the time. 2 hours later, they stood side by side in a conference room at WGN Chicago. Cameras lined the walls. Microphones crowded the table. Ethan adjusted his jacket. Naomi sat still, hands folded, eyes forward. The producer gave a nod. You're live in 5, she said. Ethan glanced at Naomi. Ready? Naomi didn't look at him. This isn't about being ready. The red light turned on. The host leaned forward. Mr. Whitmore, Miss Carter, thank you for joining us. Ethan spoke first. I want to be clear, he said. This isn't a PR move. This is a correction. The host turned to Naomi. Ms. Carter, do you trust him? The question hung in the air. Naomi took a breath. I trust actions, she said. Not words. Ethan nodded. I deserve that, he said. The interview moved fast. Questions about profits, about lawsuits, about whether this was guilt or calculation. Naomi answered with facts. Ethan answered with ownership. When it ended, the room buzzed. Outside, protesters had already gathered. Some held signs reading, Justice isn't optional. Others read, Don't trust billionaires. Ethan watched from the window. They don't believe me, he said. Naomi zipped her coat. They shouldn't. Not yet. They stepped outside together. Cameras flashed. Voices shouted. Mr. Whitmore, are you admitting wrongdoing? Basile, Carter, are you being used? Is this just damage control? Naomi stopped. She turned to the crowd. I wasn't invited into this partnership, she said clearly. I demanded it. The crowd quieted slightly. And if it fails, Naomi continued, it won't fail quietly. Ethan felt the weight of her words. That afternoon, the backlash intensified. A major investor pulled out. Stock dipped 8%. Headlines shifted tone. Whitmore risks, company for activist agenda. Ethan sat alone in his office, reading the article. A knock at the door. Naomi entered. You okay? She asked. Ethan laughed once. Define okay. She sat across from him. You knew this wouldn't be easy, she said. I didn't know it would be this loud, Ethan replied. Naomi leaned back. Good. Ethan looked at her. You're enjoying this? No, Naomi said. I'm respecting it. She stood. We have a community meeting tonight, she said. Southside. You said you wanted transparency. Ethan hesitated. They won't welcome me, he said. They don't need to, Naomi replied. They need to see you. That evening, the community center was packed. Folding chairs filled every corner. People stood along the walls. When Ethan walked in, the room stiffened. Whispers spread. That's him. That's the developer. Naomi stepped forward. He's here to listen, she said. Not to defend himself. An older man stood. You ruined my block, he said. Why should we trust you now? Ethan swallowed. You shouldn't, he said. Not yet. A woman followed. My kids had to switch schools because of your rent hikes. Ethan nodded. I know. The questions kept coming. Anger, pain, exhaustion. Ethan didn't interrupt, didn't justify, didn't explain. When the room finally quieted, Naomi spoke. This isn't reconciliation, she said. It's accountability. She turned to Ethan. And accountability doesn't end tonight. Ethan nodded. I'll be here, he said, as long as you let me. The room remained tense, but something shifted. Not forgiveness, possibility. Later, outside the center, Naomi and Ethan stood under a flickering streetlight. You didn't walk out, Naomi said. I wanted to, Ethan admitted. She nodded. That's the point. They stood in silence. This partnership, Ethan said, will cost me more than money. Naomi met his eyes. It already has, she said. Now let's see if you're willing to keep paying. Pause here. If you're listening and you believe real change invites resistance before it invites trust, subscribe to this channel, like this story, and leave a comment. Should people be judged by who they were or by what they're willing to become? Because in the next scene, the pressure will test Ethan and Naomi in ways neither expected. And only one thing will determine whether this story ends in collapse or transformation. 3 weeks later, Chicago was louder than ever. The partnership had moved from headlines to hearings. City council chambers were packed. Reporters lined the walls. Community members filled the seats. On the long table at the front sat Ethan Whitmore, his attorneys, and beside him, Naomi Carter. This was no longer about intent. It was about proof. The chairwoman banged the gavel. We're here to review allegations regarding past redevelopment practices by Whitmore Holdings. Ethan kept his hands folded. He hadn't slept much. Neither had Naomi. A projector hummed to life. A city investigator spoke. We've uncovered internal communications suggesting deliberate delays in maintenance to accelerate tenant displacement. A murmur swept the room. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. Emails appeared on the screen. Dates, subject lines, names. One name surfaced repeatedly. Graham Holt, former regional director. Trusted lieutenant. Ethan's man. Naomi glanced at Ethan. He shook his head slightly. He hadn't seen these. The investigator continued. These emails indicate a strategy to encourage turnover prior to refinancing. A council member leaned forward. Mr. Whitmore, were you aware of this? Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it. He didn't know, but he should have. I wasn't aware, he said finally, but that doesn't absolve me. His attorney stiffened. Naomi didn't move. Outside, news alerts exploded. Developer emails reveal displacement strategy. Whitmore Holdings under investigation. The hearing recessed. In a quiet hallway, Ethan confronted his attorney. Why didn't I see this? You delegated, the attorney replied. That's how companies work. Naomi stepped closer. Delegation isn't invisibility. Ethan nodded. Find Graham. They found him that night. A private office, frosted glass, rain streaking down the windows. Graham Holt looked older than Ethan remembered. Tired, defensive. You threw me under the bus, Graham said. Ethan shook his head. You drove the bus. Graham scoffed. You wanted results. I delivered. By breaking people, Ethan said. Graham leaned forward. By protecting the company. Ethan's voice was low. The company doesn't need protection from the truth. Graham laughed. You think this ends well? Investors won't forgive this. Ethan stood. I'm not asking for forgiveness. Naomi watched from the doorway. You signed off on the culture that made this possible, Graham continued. Don't pretend you're clean now. Ethan met his eyes. I'm not pretending. He turned and walked out. The next morning, Ethan held a press conference. No lawyers at his side, just him and Naomi. Cameras rolled. I failed to see what my company was doing in my name, Ethan said. That failure harmed people. A reporter shouted, Are you admitting wrongdoing? Yes, Ethan said, and I'm accepting the consequences. Naomi spoke next. This is not about one man, she said. It's about systems that reward harm when no one is watching. Ethan nodded. Effective immediately, I'm placing my controlling shares into a blind trust overseen by a community advisory board. Gasps. And, Ethan continued, I'm stepping down as CEO. The room erupted. Naomi looked at him, surprised this time. Afterward, in a quiet stairwell, she confronted him. You didn't warn me, she said. Ethan's voice was steady. You said accountability doesn't end. This is mine. You're giving up control, Naomi said. I already lost it, Ethan replied. I'm choosing what comes next. The fallout was brutal. Stock plunged. Lawsuits followed. Friends disappeared. Ethan moved out of his penthouse. He rented a modest apartment near the South Side, not as a gesture, but because it felt honest. Naomi worked around the clock. Families came forward. Stories poured in. One night, exhausted, she found Ethan sitting alone at the community center. You didn't have to come, she said. I do, Ethan replied. If I'm going to rebuild, it starts here. They sat in silence. I don't trust you yet, Naomi said. I know, Ethan replied. I'm not asking you to. She studied him. Then why keep showing up? Ethan thought for a moment. Because for the first time, he said, I can't buy my way out. Naomi nodded slowly. Weeks passed. The advisory board formed. Residents spoke. Decisions slowed, but improved. One afternoon, a mother approached Naomi with her children. Is this place safe? She asked. Naomi looked at Ethan. He answered honestly. We're making it safer. The mother nodded. That's enough. For now. Late that night, Ethan stood alone outside the building at 742 West Calumet. The lights were on. People were home. Naomi joined him. This is where it started, she said. And where it has to keep going, Ethan replied. They stood together, not allies, not enemies. Partners bound by consequence. Pause here. If you're listening and you believe real accountability costs something real, subscribe to this channel, like this story, and leave a comment. Should redemption require sacrifice, or is sacrifice the proof of change? Because in the final scene, the city will decide whether Ethan Whitmore's fall becomes a failure or a foundation, and Naomi Carter will decide whether trust is possible at all. 6 months later, Southside, Chicago. The building at 742 West Calumet Avenue no longer looked like a symbol of conquest. It looked like a place people lived. Children's bikes leaned against the fence. Laundry fluttered from balconies. A mural covered the side wall now, painted by local artists. It showed families, hands linked, rooted to the ground beneath them. A new plaque sat beside the entrance. Community stabilized housing pilot, managed with residents, not over them. Ethan Whitmore stood across the street, hands in his coat pockets. No cameras, no reporters, no board members. Just him. He no longer wore tailored suits. Today, it was a simple jacket, scuffed shoes. He looked like someone who belonged to the sidewalk, not the skyline. Behind him, footsteps approached. Naomi Carter stopped beside him. "They moved the last family back in this morning," she said. "Third floor, 2 kids." Ethan nodded. "Good." They stood quietly, watching a little boy chase a ball down the sidewalk. His mother laughed, calling after him. "For a long time," Ethan said, "I thought losing everything would feel like punishment." Naomi glanced at him. "And now?" she asked. "Now it feels like clarity," Ethan replied. Naomi didn't respond immediately. The city had changed them both. The advisory board met every month now. Decisions took longer. Arguments were louder. But families stayed. Rent stabilized. Repairs happened before complaints. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. "You never asked for redemption," Ethan said. "That surprised me." Naomi folded her arms. "Redemption is personal. Accountability is collective." Ethan nodded. "Do you trust me?" he asked quietly. Naomi looked at the building, then the street, then back at him. "I trust what you're doing," she said. "Not who you say you are." Ethan accepted that. A woman approached them cautiously, mid-30s, tired eyes, hopeful posture. "Ms. Carter?" she asked. "Yes," Naomi replied. "I just wanted to say, thank you," the woman said. "We were in our car for a month. My kids start school next week." Naomi smiled warmly. "You don't owe me anything." The woman hesitated, then turned to Ethan. "You too," she said. Ethan swallowed. "I'm glad you're here." She nodded and walked away. Ethan exhaled slowly. "That's more than I expected," he said. Naomi watched the woman go. "That's more than you deserved 6 months ago," she replied. "Growth isn't comfort, it's endurance." Later that evening, the community gathered in the center down the street, folding chairs, coffee in paper cups. No banners, no speeches, just neighbors. Ethan sat in the back. Naomi stood at the front. "We've learned something these past months," she said. "Systems don't change because one person feels bad. They change because people refuse to look away." She glanced at Ethan briefly. "And because some people are willing to give up power instead of protecting it." Applause followed, not thunderous, but sincere. After the meeting, Ethan walked home alone. His apartment was small, quiet, honest. On the wall hung one photograph, not of buildings, not of awards, a photo of the mural on West Calumet. He stood there for a long time. For the first time, his legacy wasn't measured in square footage. It was measured in who got to stay. Across the city, Naomi sat at her desk reviewing applications, names, stories, lives still in motion. Her phone buzzed. A text from Ethan. "Thank you for not letting me buy my way out." She stared at it, then typed back. "Thank you for staying when it cost you something." Outside her window, the city hummed. Chicago didn't need heroes. It needed witnesses. It needed people willing to be uncomfortable long enough to change something. And maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of that. If you've listened this far, take a moment. Subscribe to this channel if you believe stories like this matter. Like this video, if you believe accountability should cost something. And comment below. Do you think people should be judged by their past, or by what they're willing to give up to make things right? Because real change doesn't happen in ballrooms. It happens on streets like West Calumet, and it begins the moment someone decides that money will no longer be louder than truth.